So first of all, if you can just sum up for me, what do you think of Clementine Churchill?
I admire her. The closer I got to her writing the book, the more I liked her as well. She was a flawed person. She could go into these sort of huge rages, flashing eyed furies, people called them. She got upset at ridiculous things sometimes, but I guess we all do that. She had a very hard life. What I admire so much about her is the fact that she fought so hard to overcome her own insecurities, her own faults, her own weaknesses, to do her best, both by Winston and ultimately by her country in the Second World War. I don't think anyone could have put more into it than she did. And you have to admire someone who does that. And you also have to feel an empathy for how she suffered afterwards.
It is quite amazing that somebody so important has just been airbrushed out of history, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, I do find this absolutely extraordinary because the more you find out about her and him, the more you realise he relied on her completely. They were totally entwined, even though actually they spent quite a lot of their marriage apart. They utterly depended on each other. He more on her than the other way round. He was an immensely emotional person, very, very needy. She sort of provided all the emotional sustenance, but it wasn't just that. She was his political counsellor, his spin doctor, his lobbyist, everything really. She really was incredibly involved in every aspect of his life.
So begin at the beginning. Tell us about her early life. It wasn't happy, was it?
No, it wasn't. Her mother, Lady Blanche, was a bit of a Victorian wild child. So her life was a little bit rackety. She was also pretty short of money when her parents got divorced. Her putative father, Hosier, wouldn't pay any money or very little money. They had to keep moving from one set of furnished rooms to another to escape the bailiffs. In the end, they moved to Dieppe to do that.
So she met Churchill initially at a dance when they didn't connect, and then at a dinner when he seemed to latch on to her. And then it seems pretty quickly they got married, and she absolutely devoted herself to him and his career. She made sure that he got where he did.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she liked to be needed, definitely, but there was more than that. I think in another age, she might well have become a leader in her own right. I mean, she did once say, oh, I'd love to be a statesman if only I'd been born with trousers and not petticoats. So she saw his career as her life's work, and it was. She devoted everything. She read up on historical biography. She read up on politics. She got to know all the politicians. She observed them. She read about their policies. She quite quickly became incredibly astute at judging, particularly, forthcoming trouble. She could see trouble before Winston could quite often, and would warn him about it. And she was really quite amazing. And remember, this was all before she could vote. And when Winston Churchill was away in the trenches in the First World War, after Gallipoli went wrong and he went there to try and sort of rehabilitate himself, she, a mere 31-year-old, would invite prime ministers, newspaper editors, anyone to dinner that she thought might be able to help Winston and his career could go back on track. She really was formidable.
Asquith said she was a thundering bore.
She didn't think much of Asquith either. Asquith sacrificed Winston, in her view, after the Dardanelles, after Gallipoli. She also thought that he drank too much champagne, spent too much time flirting and chasing women during the First World War, when, of course, a whole generation of young men were being slaughtered in the Flanders mud. He sensed her disapproval, and that was him getting back at her, saying she was a thundering bore. I don't think she was. She was quite moralistic, but she could be a lot of fun.
So fast forward to the Second World War, and you say in your book that they seem to have been quite excited by the prospect. You say they were far from downcast, is the phrase you used.
If you consider what had happened to them the previous few years, they'd been social and political pariahs. They had been banging on about Hitler being a threat when that was not fashionable at all. The upper classes were, if anything, sort of rather interested, impressed by Hitler. They saw him as this kind of muscular hero, a bulwark against the communists in the East. The Churchills took a very, very different view, but this meant that no one would speak to them for a long, long time. Churchill's career was in tatters. There was really no career. They were also running out of money. They faced bankruptcy. Everything was going wrong, and they felt totally shunned and discarded. But of course, when the war did come, they would prove right. Churchill was back in favour. People said, we'll bring Churchill back into government, get him on board, make sure that he's running things. And suddenly, although this was a piece of news in many, many ways, it meant that they had been proved right. They were back where they belonged, both of them at the hub of power, and they could do their duty, which is what they were really both obsessed with.
It came to the point where Chamberlain couldn't carry on any longer. There was a coalition government, and everyone saw that he was the man to take charge. So how did she help him during the Second World War?
She did many things. First of all, he was obviously completely caught up with the fighting abroad, with trying to sustain and build up an alliance of nations against the Nazis. That took up all his time, all his energy. She noticed that the home front in many ways was being neglected. She started going on on tours of air raid shelters, particularly once the Blitz started in 1940, and the conditions there were terrible, and she realised that people were going to get resentful. There was no heating, no lighting, no escape routes often if the shelters were hit. She started making sure that this happened. She badgered ministers. She exploded at officials if they refused to do anything. And so gradually, people saw her as a people's champion. So she became his direct line, if you like, to the people, or the nearest that he had to one. Everything that she picked up on these tours of bomb sites, air raid shelters, factories, all these other places, she fed back to him, and they went straight into his speeches, which, by the way, she helped to edit. And one of the things that they came up with jointly was that he would never use a word that someone with only an elementary education would have to look up in a dictionary. This was a brilliant piece of understanding how the power of simple words, and in fact that's what he stuck to all the way through. So she also later on she took on presidents. When de Gaulle was misbehaving, she would tell him off, but equally she would tell Winston to sort of calm down too and stop being so abrasive with de Gaulle. So she was this sort of extraordinary ambassador as well as everything else. One of the things that she was a brilliant hostess. She realised that we needed American support, and this is before Pearl Harbor, before they were behind us. We couldn't carry on. We were completely bankrupt. We'd lost a lot of our military equipment at Dunkirk. We simply couldn't carry on without some kind of support from the Americans. She was brilliant, working in tandem with Churchill to woo over certain very, very important Americans, those who were very influential with President Roosevelt. And she did that through charm, through good cooking, through making sure they saw only the right people at the right times. And Harry Hopkins, for instance, came over, complete Anglo-sceptic, didn't like the Brits, didn't like the monarchy, went back after 6 weeks to Roosevelt and said, they're just incredible people from top to bottom. We've got to help them. And you know what? The most incredible person of all? Mrs. Churchill.
They also appear to have pimped out their daughter-in-law, Pamela, to any influential American in town.
It's not quite a word I would use. What they did was they allowed certain liaisons to happen. They may well have encouraged them. I think they probably did. Certainly Pamela's husband, their son, Randolph Churchill, thought they did. Pamela was a very sexy woman. She was very flirty. Her marriage was going nowhere. It was very unhappy. The Americans thought she was really rather gorgeous. Quite soon she was in bed with Admiral Harriman, President Roosevelt's special envoy, in charge of supplying important equipment to us. That relationship became very important. She fed certain information to him that was very much to our benefit. Again, when he went back to America, people thought he'd been bewitched by the Brits because he was so ardent in his arguments in our favour. And various things did happen as a result.
Clementine Churchill had a good relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt as well, didn't she?
She did. Much better than Winston. Winston Churchill and Eleanor Roosevelt did not see eye to eye at all. She was too earnest, too much of a feminist for him. Clementine was a supporter of women's rights. She was more subtle about it. They saw in each other very different women, but a lot of things in common. They'd both had sort of difficult childhoods. They'd both been insecure, but they'd both suffered from depression. And here they both were, married to the men whose job it was to try to save the world. So they saw in each other a certain kind of, comradeship, if you like, although Clementine was always quite difficult to get to know. But they learned from each other a great deal. Eleanor was giving press conferences, was much more chatty, much more directly involved with people. Clementine watched what she did, and she wrote to Roosevelt and said how marvellous your wife is and what she's able to do with reporters and members of the public. And she took on board a lot of what she did, and quite soon she was giving her own solo press conferences, and her first one ever was in Washington, where she entertained the American press, and she went down a storm, and people watching said, oh, you know, she's just like Mrs. Roosevelt.
But she didn't think much of President Roosevelt, did she? Because he called her Clemmy.
Yes, you had to earn that right. Although she became much more relaxed about it after the war. Normally it took about 2 years if you were very, very lucky to call her Clemmy. And President Roosevelt called her Clemmy first time. And she didn't like that at all. This was one of the occasions when she could be a bit over-judgmental. Although that meeting was when she was very tired and not feeling very well. I mean, the war did take it out of everyone, including her. She did think he was rather vain, however. And she always warned Churchill, just be a little bit careful with the president.
She actually missed VE Day, didn't she? Because she was in Moscow at the time, being awarded for her work with the Red Cross.
There was a point where we were unable to help Russia, who had terrible, terrible casualties from the German invasion. I mean, we talk about 27 million people now having died in the war. We couldn't really help them. Stalin was, calling for us to help them. We had no spare men. We had no spare equipment. So Clementine came up with this idea with the Red Cross that what we could do is raise money from ordinary people, all sorts of people, to re-equip their hospitals, which had been bombed by the Germans and had nothing to help people who'd been injured. So she raised the equivalent, quite extraordinary this, of £300 million, what would be £300 million today, to help these hospitals from all sorts of people, including also, actually, she pioneered the idea of celebrity concerts, celebrity football matches, but also a penny a week from all sorts of people, school children, this kind of thing. Even Stalin, who was no fan of Churchill, let's face it, was incredibly impressed by this. And he invited her over towards the end of the war to see what she had been able to do, or what they had been able to do with her money, and to give her a special award. And he invited her on her own to the Kremlin to meet him. And they had this meeting in Stalin's study at the Kremlin. It's just extraordinary if you can think now, or imagine Sam Cam going to see Putin or something. I mean, this was an unbelievable thing to happen. Anyway, this meant that she was in Moscow when VE Day happened, and she stood in the chair in the British Embassy and toasted every victory with everyone there.
Doesn't sound like she was much of a mother, though.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, Mary, her youngest child, used to say that, father came first, second and third, and I think that's true. He was emotionally needy. He took everything out of her that she had, and she really did have little left for anyone else. I would also say that I don't think we should just blame her. I don't think he was a very good father either. He could be great fun, of course, and he would arrive with great fanfare and do fun things with the kids, but as soon as they got overwrought, he would hand them over to someone else and disappear back into his adult world. Neither of them had been parented well themselves, of course, so they didn't really have role models to go on. I don't think she really, perhaps, if she'd had a choice in the matter, perhaps she wouldn't have even been a mother. I think at a different age, she might have been a career woman who didn't have children. That didn't happen. She didn't deal very well with it, and there were terrible consequences, it has to be said.
I've been trying to think who they best remind me of, and actually it's not another British couple, it's the Clintons. Their relationship was more like the Clintons than anything else. I mean, Clementine didn't go to university herself, but they were a real political partnership, weren't they?
People who worked with them, particularly again during the Second World War, and one of them, Churchill's chief of staff, General Pug Ismay, I mean, he said that without Clementine, the history of Winston Churchill and of the world would have been very different. They did complement each other. Their own child, Sarah, one of their daughters, said they were like the sun and moon, and that they complemented each other very, very well. And it is really hard, now that I've found out so much about Clementine, really to consider in any way that Churchill could have been on his own and coped with what he did. And he, in fact, wrote her a little note. He pushed it under her bedroom door on the day of their 40th anniversary in 1948, saying that without her, none of his life and his work would have been possible. And I really do think that's true.